This is a quick re-recording of the shiur for Berakhot Daf Lamed Tet, which was live, but the sound recording did not come out well, so I'm quickly re-recording it. We begin on the bottom of Lamed Chet Amud Bet with the words Amar le Rabbi Yirmiyah le Rabbi Zera. Amar le Rabbi Yirmiyah le Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Yochanan hechi mivarech al zayit maliach. We learned in the previous daf that Rabbi Yochanan said a beracha, he said a blessing on a salted olive. A salted olive is considered the same as an olive that had been cooked, because salting is like cooking. And the Gemara told us that Rabbi Yochanan had said a beracha before the salted olive as well as afterwards. So the question is, how could he say a beracha on after eating a salted olive? Kevan de shakila legarine, since he removed the pit of the olive, obviously, that must mean batzar le shiura, as we turn to Amud Aleph of Daf Lamed Tet, the first three words. The shi'ur, the measurement necessary for an after blessing, for a concluding beracha, is a kazayit, the size of an olive. An olive's volume of food must be consumed in order for one to say a concluding beracha. And in this case, obviously, by definition, if Rabbi Yochanan has removed the pit of the olive, which we assume he must have, since nobody consumes the pits of olives, that means that by definition, he's eaten less than a complete olive's volume. Amar le, mi savrat kazayit gadol ba'inan. He responded to him by saying, Rabbi Zera responded to Rabbi Yirmiyah by saying, did you think that we need the size of a large olive? In other words, is the minimum measure of eating a large olive's volume? No. Kazayit benoni ba'inan va'ika. All we need is the size of a medium olive. And the one that they brought to Rabbi Yochanan that he consumed, that he ate, was a large olive. So it works out that since Rabbi Yochanan ate a large olive, even after removing the pit, that what was left was still equal in size to a medium olive with the pit. So if you could think about it as an equation, large olive minus pit is equal to medium-sized olive including pit. So therefore, the amount that Rabbi Yochanan ate, since he ate a large olive without the pit inside, was surely enough to require a concluding beracha. Titnan, as we learned in the Mishnah. That whenever we speak in halacha about requiring the minimum measurement of an olive, we're talking not about a small olive, not about a large olive, but an average medium-sized olive. This is also called aguri. Amar Rabbi Abau said, Lo aguri shemo ela avruti shemo, v'amre la samrusi shemo. They offered two alternative names for this kind of olive. One is avruti and one is samrusi. Everybody agrees, however, that aguri is not the real name. If so, v'lama nikra shemo aguri, so why is it called, in common parlance, referred to as aguri? Sheshamno agur betocho, because the oil of this olive is contained inside, and therefore it's called aguri. So essentially what we conclude is that the volume of a medium olive, including the pit, which would be equivalent to the volume of a large olive, excluding the pit, is the amount that one must eat in order to require a concluding beracha. Ne'ma ketanae. Perhaps the question discussed on the previous daf about what beracha to recite on vegetables that have been cooked is actually the subject of a dispute among earlier authorities. Because it happened that once two students were sitting in front of bar kapara. They brought before them keruv, which is cabbage, dur maskin, which is translated by some mefarshim as prunes, but this becomes difficult because apparently the beracha would have been borei pri ha'adama, would have been a fruit of the ground, not a fruit of the tree. So it's not entirely clear whether dur maskin are in fact prunes. Some say it's another type of vegetable, upargiot, and chicken. Natan bar kapara reshut le'echad mehen levarech, so bar kapara allowed one of the students to say the beracha on behalf of everybody else. Kafatu verech al pargiot, and he went and blessed on the chicken. Ligleg alav chavero, his colleague, his friend, criticized and made fun of him. Ka'as bar kapara got angry. Amar, lo ala mevarech ani koes, ala milagleg ani koes. He said, I'm not angry at the one who blessed, I'm angry at the one who made fun. Im chavercha dome ki mishlo ta'am tam basar me'olam, ata al maliglagta alav. If your friend is like someone who's never had meat in his life before. Why are you making fun of him? In other words, since he had a choice of what to make the beracha on, and he chose chicken, apparently he really likes chicken. Why are you making fun of him? Chazar v'amar, then Bar Kapara went back, he retracted and said, Lo ala milagleg ani ko'es. I'm not angry at the one who made fun. El ala mivarech ani ko'es. I'm angry at the one who made the beracha. V'amar im chochma in kan, zikna in kan. Because if there's no wisdom here, is there not old age here? In other words, is there not experience here? Why didn't you ask me which food to bless on first? Why did you jump ahead and choose on your own? So he criticized both of these students, Tana ushneim lo hotziu shinatan, and it was taught that neither of these students lived out the year. The first one, because he jumped ahead and made a beracha on the food without consulting with his teacher, without properly showing deference to Bar Kapara. And the second student, because by making fun of his friend, he demonstrated arrogance, because a student should not make fun of another student in front of the teacher. It's not the student's job to criticize another student in the presence of the teacher. It's as if he's putting himself on par with his teacher to do so. It's disrespectful of the teacher. My love, but going back to the substance of what happened here, one side apparently maintained, the student who jumped ahead and said the beracha on chicken apparently thought that there was no problem in doing so. Because the one who went ahead and made a beracha on the chicken thought that vegetables that are cooked and chicken are both shehakol nihya bidvaro. We say the general catch-all blessing for both. Hilka chaviv adif. Therefore, whatever you like better is the one you should say a beracha on, since they're the same beracha. Umelagleg savar shelakot brei pri ha'adama pargiot shehakol nihya bidvaro. Hilkach peradif. And the milagleg, the one who criticized, said, you made a mistake because vegetables are brei pri ha'adama and chicken is shehakol nihya bidvaro, and obviously borei pri ha'adama, saying the more specific blessing, the one who created the fruits of the earth, is always given precedence over shehakol nihya bidvaro. So if you hold that cooked vegetables are borei pri ha'adama, then you would have said borei pri ha'adama prior to blessing on the chicken, and therefore that seems to be the machloket. That's the disagreement between the first student who blessed on the chicken first, because he thought that they had the same beracha. He thought that vegetables that were cooked lost their status as vegetables and became shehakol nihya bidvaro. And the second student maintained that cooked vegetables retain their identity as vegetables and are still borei pri ha'adama, and that's why vegetables should have been given precedence in this case. Lo, dekulei alma shelakotu pargiot shehakol nihya bidvaro. No, the Gemara concludes, according to everyone, cooked vegetables and chicken could be shehakol nihya bidvaro. And the Gemara here is not really deciding the halacha, because actually the halacha does not follow this decision, but it's just saying, for the sake of argument, we could interpret the story here in a different way. We could interpret it even according to the assumption, even on the premise that both chicken and cooked vegetables have the same beracha. We still could have an argument, because they could be arguing about the following thing: Mar savar chaviv adif, or Mar savar kiruv adif dizayin. That one student said, whatever you like better is what you should say a beracha on first. If you have two things in front of you that have the same beracha, whatever you like better, you should choose first. And since the first student wanted chicken more, therefore he chose chicken. Whereas the second student who made fun of him said that no, when you have two things that are of equal status and get the same beracha, you should give preference to the food that is more nutritious. And in this case, cabbage, the vegetable, would be more nutritious, and that's why he criticized him for saying the beracha on the chicken. So therefore you see that even if we were to assume that both are shehakol, we would have reason to have a disagreement here between the two students. Now the halacha happens to be that anything which is cooked, any vegetable which is normally eaten in a cooked state, when it's eaten in a cooked state, you say borei pri ha'adama. When it's eaten uncooked, if it's not normal to eat it uncooked, such as a potato, you say shehakol nihya bidvaro. On the other hand, anything which is normally eaten raw, such as a cucumber, if you were to cook it, it would become shehakol nihya bidvaro. It would lose its status as a vegetable in that case. Amar Rabbi Zera said, Ki avena beravuna amar lan hanigar gedlidei derlifta. He said, these heads of turnips, peraminu perimaraba, if you cut them into big pieces, borei pri ha'adama, then you still say borei pri ha'adama, because it hasn't lost its status as a turnip. Perima zuta. If you cut it into tiny pieces, shakol niya bidvaro, then it reverts to be, you've downgraded it and it loses the original beracha. B'chiyatan levei Rav Yehuda amarlan. But when we came to the house of Rav Yehuda, he said, idi v'idi, borei pri ha'adama. Even if you cut them into tiny pieces, still it's borei pri ha'adama. V'haydei farmino tefei. But the fact that you cut it into tiny pieces, ki hechi dinimtik ta'ameh, that was just in order to make it sweeter, to make it taste better. But it doesn't actually downgrade the food. If anything, it makes it more appealing and tastier. Amar Rav Ashi said, Ke'avenan be Rav Kahana amarlan. When we were in the house of Rav Kahana, he said to us, Tavshilat silka dilama pshu bakimcha. When you're eating a beet dish, and beet dishes were not given a lot of flour. They didn't put much flour into beet dishes. So borei pri ha'adama. So you say borei pri ha'adama. De lifta de mapshu bakimcha tefei. When they would eat turnip dishes, where they would put a lot of flour in, borei minei mezonot, you would say borei minei mezonot. Va'adar amar, but then he later retracted and said, idi v'idi borei pri ha'adama, v'hai deshadeh bakimcha tefei, lidabuke ba'alma avdela. Because that even the turnip dish would be borei pri ha'adama, and the fact that you put a lot of flour into that, it's not a flavoring, it's not an ingredient of the turnip dish, but actually it's just a binder. It's just in order to give it solidity so that it won't melt into liquid or become too soft. So in order to give it some body, like the way that gelatin is used today or some other additives, starch is sometimes used today to give something more body, even though it's not part of the flavor, it's not part of the taste of the dish that you're really focusing on when you eat it. Therefore, the fact that they put a lot of flour into the turnip dish would not make it borei minei mezonot. Now, this would seem to contradict what we learned earlier in the Masekhet, that when there's flour put into anything, it becomes borei minei mezonot, even if it's only a fraction of the substance, even if it's a minority of the substance. But the distinction is made here between something which is there as part of the ingredients, in which case, even if it's a minority, if you have flour or any kind of substance from one of the 5 grains that's mixed in to a food, even if it's a minority quantitatively, it causes the beracha to become borei minei mezonot because it's considered very significant. However, when it's being used only to support and to serve as a binder for a food which is not borei minei mezonot, so it does not assume primary status in that case because it's not functioning as an ingredient in the mixture, it's functioning structurally in the mixture. Amar Rav Chisda said, Tavshil shel tiradin yafeh lalev v'tov la'inayim. Dishes of beets, eating beets is good for your heart and it's good for your eyes. And it's good for your stomach. Amar Abaye said, the only time that it's really good for you and it has these medicinal properties or these health properties is when it sits on the stove and makes a tuch sound, which means to say when it boils very, very thoroughly, when it's cooked very thoroughly, boiling over the stove. Amar Papa said, that water of beets is like beets, water of turnips is like turnips, and water of all kinds of different vegetables is like the different vegetables. In other words, what he means to say is if you make a beet soup, even if you take out all the solid beets, if you make a turnip soup, even if you take out all the solid turnips, if you make a vegetable soup, even if you take out all the vegetable substance, the water that's left, the broth, is still borei pri ha'adama. It's considered like the substance of the vegetable itself. This is brought in Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch mentions one caveat: if there's meat in the soup, then the meat becomes the primary substance, and then it becomes shakol niyabit varo again. But in a pure vegetable soup, even if you remove all the vegetables, the soup is borei pri ha'adama. Rav Papa asked, Mayad d'shivtamai. What's the story with dill added to water? Apparently they used to add dill, mix dill with water and cook the water. And the question was the dill considered a flavoring of the water? Did they put it in to put flavoring? Or is the reason why they put it in order to remove the bad taste of the water that sometimes they had a problem with? So Tashma, come and listen. Hashevet. Dill. From the time that it puts flavor into the pot. It's no longer considered teruma. There's no issue of teruma with it, and it is not able to receive tum'at. It's not susceptible to impurity anymore. In other words, once you've put the dill into the pot, even if you remove the dill from the pot afterwards, that stick, what's left of it, after it's exuded its flavor into the pot is no longer considered a food. It's no longer considered, if it was terumah before, that stick itself doesn't have any prohibition of terumah anymore attached to it, and it can't become tameh anymore. It's not a food anymore. Shemamina, but what you see from this is lematuke ta'ama avdila shemamina. We see that the reason why they put dill into the water was to add flavor, because it says from the time it puts flavor into the pot, it loses its status as a food, because all it is a flavoring. So that shows us that just like we learned about other vegetables, if you had water that was flavored with dill, it could become borei priya adama, even if you took the dill substance out. Amar Rav Chiya bar Ashi said, if you have a piece of bread that's dried out on a plate, you say hamotzi. Now they had dry bread, and the way that what they would do with the dry bread was they would take it and they would soak it in water, and it would become soft again to be able to be eaten. So the novelty here is that we're talking about a case where you had a whole loaf of bread available, and yet you're still allowed to say the hamotzi over the slice of bread, according to Rav Chiya bar Ashi. Rabbi Chiya disagreed with this. According to Rabbi Chiya, you had to finish your beracha as you're slicing the bread, which means that as the slice of bread is separating from the loaf, at that very moment the beracha is being completed. So unlike Rav Chiya bar Ashi, who said that even if the slice is already sitting there, it's the same thing, according to Rabbi Chiya, that's not good. You have to start with the whole loaf and be in the process of cutting it as you're saying the beracha, and the beracha should conclude exactly as your cutting is concluding. The idea here being that we want to minimize the separation between the completion of the beracha and your actual eating of the bread. So according to Rabbi Chiya, that's accomplished by saying the beracha as you're cutting, finishing the beracha and the cutting at the same moment. So Matkifla Rava had an objection to this. Why did you tell us that why did you disagree, Rabbi Chiya, with Rav Chiya bar Ashi, and tell us that we should not say the beracha on the slice of bread alone? What was the reason? Mishum kalya beracha apurusaka kalya. The reason is because when is he saying the beracha? He's saying it on a piece, on a slice, instead of on a loaf. In other words, when he's saying the beracha, when he concludes that beracha, it's concluded over a slice. But alapat nami. But according to the way you're doing it, it's the same thing. Kika gamara, aprusa gamara. It's the same thing as we turn to lambetet amud bet. It's the same problem, because the way you're doing it, as you're slicing, you're saying the beracha. So when you actually complete the words min haaretz, the slice is separating. So there's no moment where the bracha has been completed and the bread is still intact. So what difference does it make if the slice is in front of you and you say the bracha, or if you're making the slice and by the time you finish your bracha, you also have a slice? So at the end of the day, it's really the same concept. So therefore, Ela Amar Rava says, Mevarech v'achar kach potzea, the bracha should be completed before any slicing is done. Nehar de'e avdi ki Rabbi Chiya. In Nehar Da'a, they followed Rabbi Chiya's position, which means to say that they would slice as they were saying the beracha. Rabbanan avdi Rava. The rest of the rabbis followed the position of Rava, not to say the beracha. Not to slice the bread until the beracha was said. Amar Ravina said, Amra li em, my mother told me, Avuch aved Rabbi Chiya, your father followed Rabbi Chiya. The Amar Rabbi Chiya tzarich shetichle beracha imapat, v'Rabbanan avdi Rava. That his father followed the view that the beracha should be recited as the cutting was taking place. The rabbis followed the position of Rava, that we say the beracha and then cut. The halacha follows Rava, who said you bless and afterwards slice. There is some discussion in the Mefarshim about actually how this works. Some have the custom to make a little bit of slicing on the top of the bread before they say Birkat HaMotzi, in order to minimize the amount of time between the slicing and the consumption of the bread. Some actually go so far, such as the Shulchan Aruch mentions, to slice halfway down the loaf, in other words, to slice halfway down and to wait there not to completely separate the first slice off of the loaf, but to have it halfway down, the knife is halfway down, and then saying Birkat HaMotzi, and when the HaMotzi is over, completing the slice and eating the bread. That way, again, you minimize the amount of time between the recitation of the beracha and the eating of the bread, but you don't actually recite the beracha over an incomplete loaf, because as long as that slice is still attached to the level that when you hold the loaf, the slice remains attached and doesn't fall off, that's still considered a loaf that's intact. So, but the Rambam actually says that one should just say the entire beracha before doing anything to the challah or to the bread at all. Itmar. It was stated, if they bring before, it was brought before them pieces of bread, broken pieces, and complete loaves. Amar Rav Huna says, according to Rav Huna, it doesn't matter what you do. We're following the interpretation of Tosafot here. Rashi has a different approach. It's a little more difficult. So for simplicity's sake, we're following Tosafot here, which seems to be the accepted view. According to Rav Huna, you can do whatever you want. If you want to say a beracha over the pieces, you can say a beracha over the pieces. If you want to say a beracha over the complete loaves, you say a beracha over the complete loaves. And whatever you decide to hold in your hand, the beracha still applies to everything. Rabbi Yochanan amar shelema mitzvah min hamuvchar aval pirus. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's always better to say the beracha directly over the complete loaf, which means that's what you should hold in your hand. Aval pirusa shel haitin u shelema min haseorin. But if you were to have a slice of wheat bread and a complete loaf of barley bread, then divrei hakol mevarech ala perusa shel haitin ufoter et shelema shel seorin. In that case, everybody agrees. Both Rav Huna and Rabbi Yochanan agree that one should bless on the slice of wheat rather than over the complete loaf of barley, because wheat is superior to barley. And Tosafot explains because chita comes before seorah in the pasuk, in the verse that describes the blessings of the land of Israel, the fruits of the land of Israel. Wheat is mentioned before barley. It's also possible to interpret it just from a practical standpoint that chita was considered of greater value and more refined and simply superior to barley in this respect. But whatever the case may be, apparently both Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Huna would agree that if you had slices of wheat bread and entire loaves of barley bread, you would in that case and in that case only say the beracha over the slices of wheat bread. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba said, Kitanae. Actually, not everybody agrees with this last point. In fact, I'll show you that it's a machloket tanaim. It's an argument between rabbis of the Mishnah, because it says Torah min batzal katan shalem avalo chatzi batzal gadol. Because in the Mishnah it says that when we give terumah, let's say a person has small onions which are inferior in quality but they're whole, and he has a large onion which is better, it's of higher quality, but it's sliced in half. So what he'll end up giving, quantitatively speaking, to the kohen would be the same. What he'll end up separating quantitatively is the same. He should choose the smaller but complete onion over the half of a larger onion. Even though what he's giving is something qualitatively inferior, the fact is that it's whole. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Lochi. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that's not correct. Rather, he should give half of the large onion, because half of the large onion, still, it's better quality, even though it's not a complete entity. Maybe this is what they're arguing about. Because one is saying that whatever's more important, whatever's superior is better. And the other one is saying whatever's whole is better. In other words, the rabbis are saying, why should you use the small complete onion over the large half an onion? Because the small complete onion, even though it's inferior in its taste, is at least whole. And Rabbi Yehuda is saying, no, we go by quality. So since the half of a large onion is a better quality onion, we give that even though we're giving a half and not a whole. So the same thing here. Perhaps we would say that true according to Rabbi Yehuda, it would make sense that if you had a slice of wheat bread and a loaf of barley bread, that you should say the beracha over the slice of wheat bread, because he goes by quality even when it's not whole. But the rabbis who say that when it comes to terumah, you should give the smaller onion that's whole rather than the large onion that's cut in half, maybe they too would say that you should bless on the whole loaf of barley bread rather than the slice of wheat bread, even though the slice of wheat bread is qualitatively better, it's not whole. So the Gemara answers, you can't really draw an analogy here, because where there's a kohen, everybody agrees when there's a kohen available who's actually going to receive the terumah, that you go with what tastes better or what's better quality. In other words, that you would give the half of a large onion. Ki paligid like a kohen. Where do they argue? When there is no kohen. That's when they're arguing. Ditnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, kol makom shesh kohen toreh min hayafeh. Because we said that any place where there is a kohen available who's actually going to receive the gift of terumah, we give him the best that we have, even if it's not whole. and any place where there is no kohen. So therefore, we're just going to separate this teruma and leave it around for another time when a kohen comes by. Torem and a mitkayem. In that case, we would give whatever is going to last longer. So in this case, when the kohen is around, we would give him half of the large onion. When there's no kohen around, the rabbis would say we set aside the smaller onions. Why? Because they'll last longer because they're not cut. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ein Torah mela mina yafeh. According to Rabbi Yehuda, even when there's no kohen to receive the teruma, we still separate what is best and not what is whole. Reason being, the machloket would seem to be, according to the Rabbanan, the preference for a superior item is based on the recipient. In other words, there are two aspects to giving teruma. There's the giving, the separating of teruma, which is one thing, and there's the actual receiving of the teruma by the kohen. The fact that you bring it into the possession of the kohen. So if you look at the preference for a good item, the preference for a superior item as being tied to the recipient, so then when there is no recipient, you should just separate whatever is going to last the longest. You don't have to separate what is the superior quality. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says that the reason why you take what's superior quality is not because of the recipient, but because when you're doing a mitzvah, you should do it with the best. And since separating the teruma is also a mitzvah, you should do it with the best quality, even if it's not a shalem, even if it's not a whole onion. So too here, going back to our case, everybody would agree that when you're saying a beracha over a whole loaf of barley and a slice of wheat bread, that you should give preference to whatever's actually best, which is the slice of wheat bread. Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, "V'yirei Shamayim yotzei yedei shenehen." One who fears God will fulfill both sides, both opinions. How so? Umanu, who is the person who fulfilled both opinions? Marbrei de Ravina. Marbrei de Ravina. The Marbrei de Ravina maniach perusa b'toch hashelema uvotea. Because Marbrei de Ravina would put the slice in the middle of the whole loaf, and then say the beracha, and then cut the bread. Now, what does it mean that he would put it inside? Because in those days, the bread was softer. It was more like a lafa bread or a pita bread that would be folded. So he would take the whole loaf, and he would fold it around the slice, and he would say the beracha. So in this case, he would, even in our situation, where he would have a barley loaf, he would wrap the barley loaf around and insert the slice of the wheat bread inside, and say the beracha with the two combined. And that's actually what's brought down in both the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch as the proper procedure. Tanei Tana Kamei Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, a Tana, a reciter of Mishnayot, once said in front of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Maniach HaPerusa, Betoch HaShelema Uvotzeh Umvarech, that he said that the person should put the slice of bread inside the whole loaf and cut it and make the beracha. Amar Le, he said to him, Mashimcha. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said to this Tana, what's your name? Amar Le, he said to him, Shalman. Amar Le, he said to him, Shalom Ata, playing on his name, Shalman, which means peace. He said, you are peace, ushlema mishnatecha. Your teaching is complete. Also playing on the word shalman, which comes from the word complete. Shalom, peace, and completion being related. Shesamta shalom ben talmidim, because you've made peace among the students. So if there was any argument about whether one should give preference to a barley loaf or a slice of wheat bread, you have found a compromise that fulfills both views. Amar Rav Papa said, Hakol modim bepesach, shemaniach perusa betoch shelema uvotzea. Everybody agrees on Pesach that the way to do it is to combine the whole piece of matzah with the broken piece of matzah. We know that we always take the broken piece of matzah together with the large piece of matzah. When we do the motzi, we take the one from yachatz as well as a whole one, and actually in our custom, generally we have two whole ones, and we say the beracha together. Why? Ma'ita'ama, if we have a whole piece of matzah, why do we need the broken one? Lechem oni ketiv, because we want to fulfill the concept, we want to reflect the concept of lechem oni, a poor man's bread, the bread of affliction, by saying our beracha over not only a complete piece of matzah, but also the broken one. Amar Rabbi Abba said, Uve Shabbat chayav adam liftoa al shetei kikarot. On Shabbat, a person is obligated to say hamotzi over two loaves of bread. What's the reason? Because it says in the Torah that on Fridays the Jews would get when they would get their portion of man, they had lechem mishneh, they had a double portion for Friday. So to remember the miracle that Hashem provided us extra for Shabbat, we have two loaves. Amar Rav Ashi said, Chazena le Rav Kahana dinaket tarte uvetzachada. Rav Ashi said, I saw Rav Kahana that he would take two loaves, but he only cut one of them when he would make the motzi on Shabbat. Rabbi Zera hava batza kula shiruta. It says Rabbi Zera would cut the entire piece. Now, what exactly that means is not clear. According to Rashi, what it means is he would take a slice that was large enough to last for the entire meal. So he would take a very, very large slice when he would slice the bread on Shabbat. Amar li Ravina Ravashi. Ravina said to Ravashi, "V'haka mitchazi kirav tanuta." But he looks like a glutton by doing this. How can he take such a huge piece for himself? Amar le kevan dechol yoma lo ka'avid hache. Since on other days he doesn't do this, and today he's doing it. Lo minchazeh kirav tanuta. He doesn't look like Rav Tanuta. He doesn't look like a gluttonous person. It doesn't seem that way because we see that he's doing it to honor Shabbat and not because he is overly excited about eating the bread. There's another interpretation brought by the Rosh here of this Gemara that it's contrasting actually. It's not saying that Rav Kahana took 2 chalot and he only cut 1, and Rabbi Zera is unrelated. According to Rashi's view, Rabbi Zera is saying a different point, that Rabbi Zera cut a large piece that would last him the whole meal. These are 2 unrelated points. According to the Rosh, the way to read it is Rav Ashi is reporting to us that Rav Kahana would slice only one of the 2 chalot, only one of the 2 loaves of bread on Shabbat, and Rabbi Zera hava batza akula shiruta means he would slice all of them, meaning he would cut both of the loaves for lechem mishneh. And there are some who have a minhag, I believe it's the minhag of the Gra, based on the Vilna Gaon, that they slice both of the chalot, both of the loaves at the Shabbat meal, not just one of the 2. However, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch say that one is required only to slice one of the 2 loaves that are brought to the Shabbat meal. Ravami v'Ravasi ki hava mitrame lahu rifta de'eruva mivarachin aleha motzi lechem min haaretz. When Ravami and Ravasi would have the opportunity to get their hands on the bread of the eruv, they would say on it, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. In other words, they would eat it. Amri, ho'il ve'itavid be mitzvah chada, ne'evid be mitzvah achariti. They said, since it had been used for one mitzvah, we should use it for another mitzvah. What's the concept here? In those days, and even in some places today, multiple residences, multiple homes were in a single courtyard that was a walled courtyard. On a biblical level, any completely walled, enclosed area is a reshut hayachid. It's considered a private domain, and one can carry in the private domain, and from the house to the private domain, and from the private domain into the house, without a problem. However, the rabbis decreed that it should be considered like a public domain, since it's a shared space. And from a social standpoint, it is a public domain. So therefore, they said that unless one made an eruveh chatzerot, one could not carry from one's house to the courtyard, from the courtyard to the house. In order to correct this, we make an eruveh chatzerot, which means we take bread, put it in one of the houses, and say that we are all together. We're uniting all of the different families who live inside the courtyard through this bread. So this bread was called the bread of the eruv. In some communities, a new eruv is made every Shabbat. In others, the eruv could be kept from week to week, for many weeks or months. Some places use matzah in order to avoid the problem of it becoming stale. Whatever the case may be, when Rav Ami and Ravasi had the opportunity to eat or to get their hands on such bread, they would say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. They would say a beracha to eat it and to say birkat hamazon. And they said, since one mitzvah, the mitzvah of eruveh chatzerot, was already done with this bread, we might as well use it for yet another mitzvah, which is eating and saying berachot. And perhaps this means, according to Rashi, what Rashi brings is she'eravu bo etmol eruvei chatzerot, that yesterday they used it for eruv chatzerot. It sounds like, according to Rashi, on Shabbat they would eat this bread, and they said, since the mitzvah of making eruvei chatzerot was done with it before Shabbat, today on Shabbat we will use it for our Shabbat meal and fulfill yet another mitzvah with it. Have a great day.